definition of artificial intelligence is to provide human-like functions, human-like intelligent functions. And as we can tell, the current systems out there that we call AI are really nowhere near that. So this is a common characteristic of the field. People overestimate what the field can do from every time point, and that's helped and harmed the field as we go along.
The cloud is great. It solves a lot of real-world problems, but it's not just one cloud anymore. Public clouds, private clouds, edge clouds. The average business uses 5 different cloud providers. It's become chaotic and complex, with unpredictable costs, inconsistent security, multiple management tools, and different formats for workloads that span cloud platforms and providers. But it doesn't have to be that way. The Dell Technologies Cloud, powered by VMware, can be the one constant across your clouds. It brings consistent infrastructure and operations to your multi-cloud environment, so you can choose the right cloud for each application. A public cloud that lets you easily tap into services, a private cloud that's fully under your control, or the edge with cloud as a service. With a true hybrid cloud experience, your business becomes more agile with simple workload migration and easy onboarding for new assets. Your teams get to market faster. With simplified operations and automated processes, you reduce risk and strengthen your security profile. And with Dell Technologies Cloud, you have flexible consumption options, reducing your total cost of ownership. Like it or not, the business world often requires many clouds. Now, that's easier than ever, with consistent infrastructure, operations, and services across all your clouds. You get the cloud without the chaos. The Dell Technologies Cloud.
Okay, we will move on now. We've got a lot to get through, and I'd really like to finish on time. What we've learned in the previous part is how to build a chat bot, and that it's now actually possible. It's not that hard. You can just get, not to say that students are not clever, but it's kind of like an undergraduate problem, right? To build a system with the available tools. We talked about machine learning, AI, all these different definitions. And we actually played with it we actually did the calculations. So you've got a very speeded up semester course in 1 hour. And so we went through. So we're going to go a bit further than that now. We'll go into different kinds of networks, different layers. Again, usually we don't try this in a normal conference thing, but this is a workshop context. So we're just ramming tons and tons of stuff in one 3-hour section, and so you should know enough to be dangerous or go a bit further deeper on next. There's a little cartoon thing that we've looked at. We talked about supervised learning and AI, human being, and the XOR problem, and the features of deep layers. Deep learning means lots and lots of layers, and we've got to turn numbers versus us versus computers. And we're going to talk about these sort of advanced systems that are out there, just so you know what they are, so you can use them in conversation. So we're going to talk about convolution neural nets first. So this looks pretty hairy when we first look at it. This is actually this bit in the middle is the network we've just gone through. It's just a regular network with just parallel layers. What we've got here, though, is convolutions. And what is a convolution is where we've got sliding windows that slide across a data set that are filters that multiply the numbers underneath the filters. And so this was inspired by Hubel and Wiesel, who studied cat brains. They found that parts of the brain were particularly optimized for vision, and they were arranged in particular configurations to detect either straight lines, either horizontal lines or vertical lines. And there's a YouTube link I'll leave you to look at it. It's about 50 years old at this point, about how they put a little cat in a clamp, and they had electrodes to detect electrical impulses from the brain, and noticed that certain parts of the brain would be triggered by certain shapes. And so this is what's happening here. Going from first principles, we take a picture, and remember, we can only deal with patterns in numbers. So first thing we do is turn a picture into numbers. So each number represents a particular color and darkness, and we have this as our data. And then we have a convolution where we take a filter that slides across the pattern, and then we have shared weights to the next layer. And so you have these windows, and in this case it might be a 5x5 window that slides across the entire picture. And this is how the calculation works. This is what a convolution looks like. Electrical engineers know about these things in other contexts. So we take our little filter, it's called a filter, and it's got numbers inside it. And we're convolving with the underlying numbers of the picture underneath. So think of these numbers underneath pixels, and we're multiplying these numbers with the picture numbers. Oops, there we go. And so in this case, we've got the actual calculation here, and most of these are zeros. So 0 times 4 is 0, and 0 times 0 is 0, and 0 times 0 is... The only one that makes sense is 2 times minus 4, and that ends up being minus 8. And so we're ending up with the calculation, the destination pixel being minus 8. And then we do other processing. This is called pooling, for example, where we say we do another kind of filter across the windows. And remember the picture is 22, maybe it's 224 by 224, and we're sliding it, we have 64 of these filters that are going across the picture. And then within each of these, we're saying, let's do some other processing. Let's just choose the biggest number in blocks of 4. Now we just slide across the subsequent things. And what this does, it compresses the problem. It compresses the data, so we don't have to do as much computation. And it helps with overfitting. Overfitting means it only works on the training set. It won't work with anything else. It's too optimized to the training set. And then we have this other technique known as dropout, where we just throw away half of the weights randomly. And there's some analogy to the human brain there. As we grow up from a baby, a lot of our neurons are interconnected into a heavy manner. And as we learn new things, we have this pruning where the connections are pruned from neuron to neuron. And we just throw away these and then retrain to get the weights with the resultant connections. And this helps us what we call generalize better. Generalize means helps us understand data points that are not in our training set, they're in our test set. And again, so we can go back to this fairly hairy thing where we're doing this convolution, this pooling, and then we're doing another convolution and pooling. And we may have, some of the ImageNet problem, some of those implementations may have 100 of these sequences, but eventually it goes back to our plain old network we did in the last lecture. And we're just, in this particular case, is trying to detect different vehicles, cars and trucks and bicycles. And we're actually getting to a final answer. And we get to the problem we talked about, and then we can solve very good pictures. And what's inside of the picture? All we're telling it inside the picture is what's the label of the picture. And we talked about this last lecture. We're now getting to better than human accuracy for pictures. And typically what you do, just like we're talking about GPT-3, people don't train from scratch. These are models. You can go on the Keras website. Keras is a platform that allows you to basically implement this, the most basic version, in about 6 lines of code. Now, this looks very, very hairy, but the actual implementation is about 6 lines of code using the Keras platform. And what you can do is they've got a lot of networks. These Exception and VGG16 and ResNet, all these things are pre-trained networks. So I think I was talking to Rashmi. She was trying to do recognition of architectural features or architectural historical documents. You might want to you could start just from one of these. It's already been trained on various pictures and things. So when you're trying to recognize a different building or a different type of thing, you don't have to start from scratch, because the architecture's already got elements to recognize parameterizations of certain data sets. Maybe not actual Gothic architecture, but then you would start from here to maybe collect new things because it's trained a lot all the time. Some of these things will take 2 or 3 weeks to train, for example. So let's talk about more types of networks. We're going to sort of talk about these networks. Networks I've told you before, just take a static data set, right? So a fixed data set of a picture, which has got a fixed width and a fixed length. Now, often when we talk about sequence problems, these are of variable size. If I say the word Brussels sprouts, the phrase Brussels sprouts, the way I pronounce it may be shorter or longer than the way any of you pronounce it. And it may be even within those words, different phonemes are stretched or compressed. And so these vanilla networks, don't deal with like sequential data that well. So we have these things called recurrent neural networks, which are very good for language processing, even video that's changing, speech. Certainly that's a temporal data format, stock markets, again, with that sequential, of course. And, these vanilla neural networks, we just have a fixed set of inputs and a fixed output. Now, what happens if we want to change the inputs and the outputs? And we have that example in many types of things. So, for example, if we want to label a picture with a sentence, so the picture is fixed, right? It's fixed, but the sentence may have 5 words or 10 words or 3 words, or sentiment analysis, where we've got sentences of different lengths as the input. So in this case, the input changes, but we just want to say, is it happy or sad? We just want to know a binary output. This is fixed. And then you've got many to many, where that's like machine translation. You translate it from French to English. Well, depending on the sentence you're saying, it will maybe fewer words or more words. And then finally, maybe where both the input and the output is different, where maybe you're doing video transcription, as the video may be many image sequences or a short number of image sequences, and again the sentence could be a few words or longer. So we have these varying problems, and the way we do it is we use recurrent neural networks, and we use we take the output of a standard network and feed it back into the inputs of the network to maintain some kind of state and sequence. And so a standard neural network, you have inputs, you have a hidden layer, and you get outputs. And the idea is, can we actually add inputs directly to the hidden layers, the hidden nodes? And the answer is yes, you can. You can do that. And so again, we're incorporating time sequence into the model, and we can roll these all into one, and we can sort of unroll these so we have a variable set of inputs and have a variable set of outputs, both at the hidden layer level and at the output layer level. And so, for example, is we're taking slices of audio, and we need the likelihood of saying A, B, or C. The current state, basically influences what this likelihood is going to be. And you can actually do this in reverse, trying to predict Shakespeare. Shakespeare is actually not that big. It's only a few megabytes. And you can sort of generate words accordingly. You train it with data, and it turns out if you actually analyze Shakespeare, it's not actually that complicated as much as you might think. There's a very few, the vocabulary is not as large as you might think. And this is what comes out. It kind of looks Shakespearean-like, but my wife, who does English literature, is not overly impressed. These networks, these recurrent neural networks, they're very good for these short-term sequences, but you can actually get more complex problems. So a complex problem, the clouds in the sky is kind of a clouds is related to sky, and it's very near-term sequence. But if you have a sentence like this: I grew up in France with my mother and two brothers, and we had many neighbored friends, and as a result, I ended up being able to speak French as a long-term sequence. And so we have this other technique called long-short-term memory models, and this looks really hairy, but let me try and step through this a little bit, what's happening, give you some intuition. We've got inputs again, and some of these things might look familiar to you. This sigmoid function, and this sum function is sort of summing things up. And what we're getting is inputs from previous blocks. These blocks are all connected together. And we're trying to send things along. Some things we want to keep sending things along from block to block, and other things we want to forget. And so we have these valves in these particular areas that either forget data as we send it from data point to data, from block to block, or send data from block to block and maintain the knowledge. And so these things are LSTMs, and are known for, they're used in these GPT-3s that Krishna referenced to. We'll go into what that is and why that's clever. But basically, it's clever because we can have much longer term relationships than you could do otherwise. Reinforcement learning, that's the next topic. When we saw the DeepMind breakout game, what that was doing was reinforcement learning. So the data it was collecting was actually data it created itself, right? So it actually had the state of the game, and the way it collected data was by playing itself. So the more it played, the more data it played for itself. And reinforcement learning is somewhere between supervised learning and unsupervised learning. You can think of, supervised learning has a target. We label each point, and unsupervised learning has no labels. So reinforcement learning is somewhere in between. So we do have labels but they're delayed. You do something and then the score happens later on. And so we have this reward architecture. And the fundamental component of this is figuring out what the reward is. And you can think about it as how do we learn as humans again? We're trying to learn shapes and things. And reinforcement learning is sort of closer maybe to how we learn, is that we're trying to build representation of the world we're in, and then what happens when we act in that world. And so in any reinforcement learning implementation, there are several things it needs to do. One is to figure out what is the environment, what are you allowed to do in the environment, what is the goal, what is the state in that environment. So in a video game, it's like the pixels of the game itself. What are you allowed to do? So you can go up, down, left, or shoot. This is Doom, which many of us may have played when we were younger, by id Software, is the name of the company who created this game. And we get a reward, you know, it's a positive reward when we shoot someone, and we get a negative reward when someone shoots us. And again, you know, over at DeepMind, they had a number of analogies. They did a fundamental set of neural networks that basically created the data by playing the game over and over again. And by using this principle for many games, we've been able to get better than human performance. But for some games which are more complicated, and you'll see in some academic papers, they'll always post this game, Montezuma's Revenge, which is much more difficult because people are going up and down and sideways and different levels that they're working on, that are, you can think of it as like Portal. They're like time jumps, if you think, into different scenarios where the environment changes completely when you go to a different level. Whereas something like Space Invaders, yes, you change to a different level, but the environment is pretty much similar. From they just move faster, or there are more of them. Generative adversarial networks, these are very interesting. These have two types of networks. This is to one extent where maybe AI can be creative. And the idea here is, can you actually create stuff? And there's really two networks working in parallel with each other, fighting with each other. So one network's generating data, and the other data is saying, is this data a candidate of a data set that I want to consider as real candidates? So the example here is this network here, the generator network, is trying to create a character. And at the beginning, you just put noise through it. And at the beginning, it's presenting rubbish. And so this discriminator network says, well, this is obviously not a character when it's rubbish, but it changes, it gets better and better. And eventually it comes to something that looks like a character. And the discriminator says, well, I can't tell the difference. I'm not sure whether this can be in the core training set or not. I don't know whether this is a real or fake or not. And you can do this to create some very interesting things. So I had a student, Robbie Barrett, who was quite a young student, was about 18 years old, and hadn't gone to university yet, but he trained it on 14,000 paintings, landscape paintings, and was able to create paintings, enable paintings to be created. And he actually sold them. He sold them to Business Suite. I think he didn't get as much as another company that took his code and created a painting. I think he got a couple of $1,000s for this from Business Week. But this other company took his code, created a painting, and sold it for $460,000 at Christie's, a major auction house in Europe. And then this debate was, well, who actually created the painting? Was it Robbie who wrote the code? Or was it the company who took the code and trained it on different paintings? Was it the 14,000 artists? Was it Monet and Van Gogh, which was made up of the training set? You know, or was this just a really a different version of a paintbrush that's just using a computer instead? And the critique was actually mainly in the computer science community, not the art community. The computer science community, well, this code's out there. It's a library. You can just use it. What's so special about it? Can't you just print another one? You know, why would you spend $400,000 on it? The art community seemed a bit confused about the whole thing. So the idea with these networks, you can generate these almost anything. You know, you hear about the fake news, fake pictures. As we're starting to get into healthcare, we can try and use this to things. You know, we can actually create data when we don't have it. We can predict how old you look like, how you look when you get older. It's notorious that we don't have enough data to train things. So this could be one idea. Somebody asked earlier about how do we get more data if we don't have it. So this is one idea. You have a model of some, and you create some, and there's a paper here which actually created more data to be able to be used in other systems. As we start to get into language models, we're using these LSTMs in different networks. There's a model called Elmo, and there's a model called BERT. BERT is using different directions for natural, different directional lookups in natural language processing, both forward and backward. So if you remember, language is kind of interesting because depending where the word is, it can actually relate to a different word, either ahead of the sentence or behind the sentence. BERT is a similar kind of thing. It's, again, it looks pretty complicated, but it's basically sets of LSTMs that are connected together, again, trying to map long-term relationships between words and really putting context into the language that we've actually got. And this thing that was mentioned by Krishna, he's talked about GPT-3. There's something like GPT-2, which came before that, which was trained on 40 gigabytes of data, 8 million web pages. And the resulting model was 500 megabytes. And the first article that came out was OpenAI. It was created by a company called OpenAI. It was kind of a company, it's kind of a open source lab. And the first article that came out says, we can't release this. It's too dangerous for the world. The world will be exposed. This is late November. Then like 4 weeks later, they said, oh, okay, we'll release it. And there's a little bit of hype there. Remember, I talked to you about this field. It's got a lot of hype. But they use essentially trying to figure out what sequences of words have what they call attention. What is it? Which words map to which words later on in the data set. And so, does Griezmann map to his or Frenchman? So they have these large matrices that figures out which words map to which other words. This is a language translation problem. According to, in general, it might be in rough parameterization, it could be a diagonal, but it doesn't have to be. So we've got, this word "ka" versus, relating to the word "it." And GPT-3, which is the latest one, which has got 175 billion parameters, is now being able to, there's a very large model, I think as Lalit says, depending on which one. I think the GPT-2 is $4 million to train, GPT-3 is $12 million to train. And it's created some interesting things. This is Shakespeare created by GPT-3, rewritten by Shakespeare. And this is much more impressive than the recurrent neural network system. We also have this blog here. So there are lots of posts of which people study learn from. Yes. So, and it's only until the end you realize this whole thing is written by GPT-3. This is not a blog about GPT-3. It is written by GPT-3. It happens to be about GPT-3. So, and if you start reading it, it looks quite impressive, at least on first blush. And here's a conversation with Einstein, a simulated conversation with Einstein. I think the chatbot team that Krishna's got working on is trying to get something like this. That's according. It's certainly. We can compare this with ELIZA that was developed in the late 1960s, 1970s over at MIT, and again, it's not a bad result if you start looking at this. Yes, I'm come from the future to meet you, and he smiles. And Albert laughs. Oh, really? How is the future? Right, yeah. It's 1947, yes. But there are some critiques, right? Dumb as a pile of rocks. It's it's impressive, but it's got weaknesses. The world's not going to be destroyed. And no, I quite like this one over at NYU. Performs like a clever student, hasn't done their reading, trying to get through an exam, some well-known facts, half-truths, some straight lies, just strung together. At first looks like a smooth narrative, but when you look closely, sort of, yeah, it is like an average student just sort of cutting and pasting little sentences back to others. And then other people say, well, only geeks seem to be interested by this. Everyone else, it looks like toy-like. So there's out there. And so we start to get into, let's start to get into deploying these systems, AI systems. I think, and in healthcare in particular, we want to probably look at, first of all, causation versus correlation. All these AI systems are typically looking at correlations, associations of the data. And often we see articles in the press where they've not gone through peer review. And what appears to be like a causal system, like we heard from the COVID misinformation system, that it might have been passed to people via snakes or it comes from outer space. No one's correcting these things, and these are like single data points in time. And there's a lot of work in biology in this area. So Austin Bradford Hill, I think this is my favorite sort of framework to sort of look at on a simplistic level. When you look at something and somebody says, this is the result of that. Bradford Hill looked at really, why does smoking cause cancer? Could it cause cancer? And one of the problems was any one data point, any one research point wasn't enough really to convince people. It's only the combination of the of studies that was actually convincing. And what's interesting, his framework was an area where we didn't have genomics, we didn't have these sophisticated analytical tools, but he's got a checklist that you need to go through. And causation versus correlation is something to be distinguished. So causation is something that actually causes something. So germs might cause bad smells, and they might cause disease, but the bad smells are just correlated. The bad smells are nothing to do with the disease. They're a result of the germs. And we see charts like this, and the more people who die from who were murdered is directly related to the reduction of murder rate is related to people who are not using Internet Explorer over the years. And you say, well, yes, okay. And why is that? And you say, well, it probably isn't anything to do with it. And so Bradford Hill came with this checklist, says, well, okay, let's look at this checklist. So, okay, if the more of it there is and the more of it that happens, okay, that's 1 point. Then does it happen in different places? Does it happen in Paris and London? Does it happen in Palo Alto? Does it happen with men? Does it happen in women? Is there any other reason, specificity, that could be the explanation? And then the thing that you're doing, does it actually cause it? Does the result happen after you've done it? After you've smoked a lot, then do you get cancer? Or does the cancer happen before you get smoked? So it has to happen afterwards. The plausibility, do you have actually a mechanism of why this is happening? Can you actually do an experiment to see that that the experimental evidence supports the issue? And so there are some critiques, but I think it's a pretty good set of guidelines. The critiques say, well, there could be other factors, that are confounding. And often the effects are very complex. So the guidelines are very simple guidelines. They still might not crack it. But this science of causation and correlation has sort of recently come to the fore in just the last few years. So remarkably little aspect. Most of the statistics is really looking at associations as opposed to cause and effect. So this is the book of Why by Judea Pearl. He won the Turing Prize, which is kind of like the Nobel Prize of computer science some years back, who did a very nice, I'd say reasonably accessible treatise on this science. I think it probably could be a little bit more conversational, but not too turgid. This would be a good book. Anybody who wants to look at this a bit further, if you're certainly starting your PhD, this would be like de rigueur reading, I would think. And so getting into biology, the idea is, can we get data from multiple aspects of the body? Can we stick them in neural networks? And can we predict things like age, things like illness? And then can we work back to figure out what's actually causing age? What is actually causing illness? And the holy grail is to get personalized treatment, AI for personalized medicine, because what seems to be turning out is that we are actually all different. There's a lot of characteristics that are common between us as a species. But when we're trying to find medicines or treatments that treat us, particularly that treat us and solve our problem, we're entering this age of personalized medicine. So we need the data from each of us to decide what is the right treatment for us to get the best scenario for success. And so the holy grail here is, can we detect disease before we get the disease? And how can AI do that? Probably the poster child for this, which didn't really look at too much genomics or too much biological data, but really looked at flight patterns, social media, natural language processing, and predicted, like a couple of weeks before the Chinese announced the issue of COVID-19, this was announced by this little company called Blue Dot, and they're tracking infectious diseases constantly. This is work done by Stanford, and as we know, we've got hundreds of wearables out there right now that measure all kinds of different things. And we've got the Aura Ring. They came out with a study of trying to detect COVID early. Again, we have to sort of ask that Bradford Hill analysis, what was actually happening. We're trying to measure body temperature, heart rate, respiration, to see, we're claiming to predict COVID a couple of days after infection and before the symptoms apply. I'm involved with GT Cardio, which again is a temperature monitor that measures pulse ox. It's kind of like a back to work COVID kit. Can you take all this data and again detect when you're going to get whether you've been infected before you actually show the symptoms. And so for high risk populations, this is very important. For back to work, this is very important. This is done by Professor Snyder's group over at Stanford, again, measuring purely from resting heart rate illness. In this particular case, is looking at different viral diseases and looking at the heart rate and looking at spikes in heart rate before the actual symptoms show up. And here's some COVID thing, basically doing signal processing on the heart rate. And again, trying to get differences, getting indications before the symptoms actually show up. In this lecture, we're not going through how to discover that, the F1 score and the false positives, false negatives. There's a number of measures you can do, because there's usually a number of false negatives, false positives that, if they are too much, will overwhelm the health system if people go in when they're not really ill. We'll go into now drug discovery. So AI for drug discovery. So what is a drug? So drugs consist of either small molecules or large molecules. Though people refer to these things, small molecule drugs, large molecules. Small molecules basically can be identified easily. They're taken easily. It's usually a pill. Large molecules are much more complex, more expensive to create. Usually you have to get them from yeast, and you have to use biotechnology. Genentech is famous for that, for creating insulin in these great vats. And you get these large molecules, and it's usually quite difficult to make. Unlike the small molecule, once you've got it, once you've got the chemical characterization, it's very easy to make. And so that's, you'll hear in small molecule drugs and large molecules. Large molecules have like higher entry barriers if you create one. There are other types of things, CAR Ts, trying to use the immune system. That's very now de rigueur in being as a strategy to help for the body to help itself. And then biosimilars, which are trying to create generic versions of these large molecule drugs, and which have been having difficulty making presence because they're still quite expensive to make. And so there are not actually very many medicines that are out there. There's only a few thousand out there. And in 2017, only 56 new drugs were approved by the FDA. And what these drug hunters do, they have to try and understand what the chemical processes are happening. So like in COVID-19, they talk about these spikes that get attached to our lungs, lung cells, and then take over the cell, and then take over the machinery, and the machinery of the cell is used to optimize the virus instead of the cell itself. And often we're looking for a molecule that can interact with this, and it's often a protein. And the problem is there's too many molecules. There's millions and millions of them, and if you take every possibility, there's too many possibilities to try all of them, because each one costs tens of thousands of dollars to do each one of them. And so what we can do is try and do screening to find a lead molecule. That's when they talk about finding a lead. And once we've got a lead, we're going to find which is the embodiment of the lead molecule that can be used in actual trials. So trials with animals to start off with, and then people. And AI can be used for trying to optimize the trials, finding, okay, well, only certain people are helped by these drugs. Who are they? Can we actually increase the chances? So there's personalized medicine context. And these trials are very expensive and they take a long time. It can take, a decade to get a drug out there. And the idea here is, can we get new drugs with artificial intelligence? And so this is the disruptive force that's going on right now, is can we actually reduce the cost and reduce the time by an order of magnitude? And here we use kind of different techniques. What's quite common in drug discovery is using literature search. Now, the problem is there's 1 million articles published every year, and no one's got time to read them. And so can you get a machine to read them and find relationships between the articles? So one article might say, A affects B, or A interacts with B, but B, and another article says B interacts with C, but there's no actual article that says B interacts with C. So can we get new relationships that are previously undiscovered, which historically would be left to PhD and doctoral students to try and figure out by reading lots and lots of papers and try and interpret something? Can we actually figure out something that is unconnected and come up with a new idea? And so this is, several companies use just this principle on its own to actually try and find new drugs by cross-referencing the literature that's out there. And you create this thing called a knowledge graph. This reminds us of the expert systems that we're talking about. So we've got the neural networks, which are always statistical techniques. These are like knowledge graphs, and that can also be used. Be interesting if you use a GPT-3 architecture to use this to be trained on that system to actually create new ideas. And then mapping this in combination with neural networks, plugging the neural network, the knowledge graph, into a neural network to try and figure out which drugs might actually work on which diseases. And again, the idea is take all of the information, all the lab tests, the patient records, all the environment that the patient is in, plug them into neural network. Remember, what neural networks is find out very complex relationships, not straight line relationships, to figure out what possible treatments can be effective in these systems. Then you can use this for retraining the system. And so I've got really two case studies, companies I'm involved with, that use completely different approaches. One is Helix and one is Oxford Drug. So Helix uses text mining thing in a big way. And Oxford Drug uses like de novo chemical formulation. So Helix basically is a combination of biochemists and machine learning PhDs. And really we're trying to reduce the number of the cost to create drugs and the time. And we've used the literature data set, we use the health data set, and right now you're even using not just formal health data sets like genomes, but anecdotal data set. There's a site called Patients Like Me. Pretty much every disease, and this company particularly acts on rare diseases, where often for every rare disease, but not just rare diseases, and other diseases as well, there's a community of people who will form a site or go to a platform like Patients Like Me and submit their symptoms and anecdotes of various things they're trying and various supplements they're taking and what side effects they receive. You can take that data as well and apply it to, in particular, to the rare disease segment, is that, which is actually not that rare. There's about 30 million people in the US that have it. If you combine all the rare diseases, about 7,000 rare diseases out there. But if you combine them all, a lot of people have it. Some of the diseases only affect a few people, but some of them affect a lot more. And the idea is, instead of targeting one disease, take all the data, both the public data and proprietary data, and then come out with predictions. Analyze all the data, the knowledge graph and the genome sequences and the patient data, and come up with new predictions, and then use that with humans. So you have professional drug farmers say, "Oh, okay, this is spit out this read. Why would it say that? Why would it say try this combination of 2 or 3 drugs?" And then particularly the third trick they use is use existing drugs in different combinations, which speeds up the process because they're already out there and so deemed to be safe. Though in combinations, they don't know whether they'll be safe. So that's still, but it cuts the time to figure that out, to get something out there. Oxford Drug is something different. Well, they're really looking at the ability of computation to actually come up with new ideas. So DeepMind have been looking at this as well for protein folding. Proteins, DNA causes RNA, which causes protein. Proteins what tell our cells what to do in terms of, and how to, the functions of our cells, whether they're muscles or detecting light. The raw recipe is in our DNA, in the genes, but that generates RNA. And it turns out the shape of the proteins that are created determines the function. So immune systems are Y-shaped, and other types of proteins have different shapes, and it determines the function. And the problem is, a bit like playing Go, is that to figure out the shape of a protein purely from its genetic sequence is a very difficult problem. So we have the DNA, but we don't know the shape of the protein. So that's the shape, biochemists call that folding, the protein folding. And it's a very complex problem. If we can figure out the shapes, again, we can find new drugs and new treatments. Normally the way to do it, you have to take X-ray crystallography. It takes a long time, it's expensive. Again, there's too many of them. It's really a trial and error process. And this project called AlphaFold really just took the genome sequence, the distances between pairs of amino acids, and the angles from known proteins, and then used that to predict new proteins, predict new shapes of protein, again using these GANs, these generative adversarial networks, to train them to generate new protein fragments and figure out the shapes of what they are. And as is common in AI, these people they claim not to have any domain expertise, but I've talked to the group, and they actually did bring some domain expertise later on, but we're able to win this competition by not by a small margin, but very large margin. It's a competition to predict protein shapes every year, and they were able to win it. And the next best entrant was far, far away from the AI prediction. So Oxford Drug is trying to use these computational techniques to create new antibiotics, and antibiotics has created a significant problem for us in that many bacteria are now resistant to antibiotics. And this might be the next pandemic, because there's the business model for new antibiotics is very, very weak. It takes too long and too much money to create them. And as a result, not many people have been working on them. And so there have not been many creations for actually decades to date. And so Oxford Drug they started like 15 years ago, and they started by sending out screensavers to people's computers so you could use computation time on everybody's laptops to help compute new predictions of drugs and shapes. And now we're using the latest techniques to predict new antibiotics. This is Halocin out of MIT. And Halocin is a screening system that, again, looked at lots of these drugs that are out there, and also supplements, and tried to figure out which ones could be used as antibiotics. And they found this one, which was, they labeled it was SU3327, but they renamed it Halocin. So Hal comes from the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, a classic movie made in 1967, which has a supercomputer called Hal, which actually has true AI. It has the human-like intelligence. The only unfortunate thing, it takes over the spacecraft and is antagonistic to the astronauts on board. And so they found that this new thing they found was actually could wipe out tons of different bacteria. And so the answer is, is this a new drug? Again, when we read these articles, if nothing else from this session is, we want to be critical and think about, well, what's the guy done? Now, how does the Bradford Hill analysis work on this? Remember, this is just a prediction. When we need to actually get these things out there, we actually have to do the clinical trials. And you really don't know what you don't know until trials have been done actually on animals and humans. Notwithstanding that, doing it in silico, i.e. on a computer, is the most important thing. If we can actually do it in a computer without going through that trouble, then we would have a buy us a lot of time. So likely we will still have to do that trouble, but can we get there more likely? Most drugs only have a 5% chance of being commercializable as they start phase 1 clinical trials. If we can change that to 30%, and that's the optimism of using these kinds of techniques, then drugs will get cheaper and quicker to get out there. So I will stop here. So if you want to learn more, there's several opportunities. R42, we have a demo day in a couple of weeks' time. You're welcome to that. You can register at r42group.com, where we've got R42 fellows. One of them did the chat bot for under Krishna's presentation, but we've got several others. These are fellows from around the world who worked on various projects. Then we've got a longevity series of lectures. If you're more interested on the biology series, again, that's available starting late this month. If any of you want to do projects, you can actually join our 8-week program that's free and work on a hands-on project, and you get a certificate. We teach you AI, the full lecture series, and teach you design thinking. And we also have a founders program. If people want to write a project, develop an idea, we can put fellows on it and actually try and commercialize this company. I'm teaching 2 courses at Stanford. One is on AI. This is a 9-lecture course, much longer version of this, much deeper, much slower, over the next like 9 weeks, starting late September. And that will go through many, many different techniques. Again, designed for people with a range of backgrounds. Anyone can register for this. They do charge for it, unfortunately. I don't charge, but they charge for it at Stanford. It's a few $100s. And I'm also teaching one which is more on the product development side. You know, are you making the right product? And you know, what are the AI nuances on that? Not really the techniques per se, but how do you actually build AI products? And basically, we break up into teams and work on a project. So we'll either give you a project or you can come with a project. So that's it. We've got a few minutes left for comments. Who would like to make any comments or questions? Let's just look at the chat.
Yeah, so all of you can unmute your lines right now.
Yes, yes. The microphone has priority over chat. So anyone who wants to comment or talk about that.
Ranjan, my name is Praveen Nara. Thank you for an amazing presentation. We learned so much in such a short time. My question is, I have a business. I have several machine learning developers. Are the courses that you just mentioned, are they available online and can they register?
Well, actually, coincidentally, normally the Stanford ones are not online, but for next semester they are online. So, and they're recorded as well. So, yes, for next semester they're online. The R42 ones are online. They're all online, but in person.
So I would say, I mean, in addition to what Ranjan said, if you need any more details, you have his email, but just contact me and I'll be more than happy to pass it on to Ranjan and the team. So as you see, there are a lot of courses that he's offering, and I did take one of his course, and it's just very informative, very nice. But just I'm sure there are a lot of questions regarding the number of courses he's offering. So yeah, just contact me, and then I can forward to Ranjan and the team.
We will. Any other comments? We can wait. We can go to 4:35, I guess, and. Are there any other comments or questions?
I just wanted to thank you. This was an incredible session. Learned a lot. Super nice. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we try to pack a lot in. It's sort of like sometimes we do take it a bit slower, but I think there's a position to try and get as much in, so then you can go deeper on any of the things you're more interested in.
Yeah. So I'm also, it's very interesting. I'm just right now also enrolled in the Harvard HBAP program. It's called Harvard Business Analytics Program. So it's very interesting to see 2 different perspectives, you know, on the same topics. AI, ML, yeah.
So Ranjan, I just had a few announcements. Let me know when you.
Oh yes,
you're
yes.
done.
Go ahead.
Okay. So first of all, again, from my side, I mean, again, appreciate Ranjan. It's always nice to listen to you. I keep on telling you I love your accent, so I can just go on forever listening to you. But I think it's the content as well, right? So I think overall we covered the introduction to AI, went deep into the model, different types of modeling, GPT, NLP, and most relevant is the healthcare, right? So a lot of things, maybe AI related technology use might be happening behind the scenes, and we don't even know what's happening. And sometimes companies just promote them, but they're not really using AI. So I think it's all over the place, right? But I think you had a whole overview of how AI is helping the healthcare industry. And we all wish that the vaccine for COVID comes sooner, and hopefully thanks to the AI techniques, right? So that's just from your side. I think from Krishna, again, great speech. You know, 5G is coming more and more, is going to come soon, I guess, this year, I guess. I mean, I'm seeing the ads from all the service providers. So I think your product is RCS. I hope all of us use soon, and all the chatbot techniques. And, you know, so I think great presentation, and all the best to you and your team. And so that's thanks to the both of you speakers spending your time. And just regarding just from the TiEcon AI ML track, we have a track tomorrow. So tomorrow, the AI/ML health, AI/ML track starts at 9:30 Pacific time and goes until 11:30, and the grand keynotes start at 8 o'clock in the morning. So you should be having access to these sessions. Make sure you register on VOA, which is an app to attend those tracks. So yeah, just wanted to make this announcement. And I think one final thing is there were questions about whether we're going to provide the slides or not in the video. So I just want to make sure that I take the conversation offline with the speakers. And I think Ranjan already said yes, but I'll just take it offline and contact all of you with a response. If they're okay, then I'll send them to you. So yeah, so I think I'm done with my announcements. I think Ranjan, any closing questions, comments?
I think it's always been great. I'm sure there's as much intelligence in the room as there is on the speaker side. So I think bottom line is anything you listen to, use some of the frameworks I hope that I've tried to transmit to listen to. How is this possible? How is this available to use? What are the limitations? Don't buy the hype, but some of it is actually generally useful, but it's often constrained in its utility. And let's stay in touch. I encourage everyone to stay in touch.
I have one last question. I have what are some social impact projects that you are involved in, especially in the EdTech place?
Yeah, I think in EdTech, we're thinking of doing a project on EdTech, and actually, right now you've got Khan Academy and things that adapt the questions according to the user. We think that they can actually extend that to different ways. That's not been started yet. The other thing is we've got an AI policy project, an AI ethics project, which there's a bit of work going out there, but I think my critique in a lot of the work out there, they're not really looking at they're treating them as black boxes, a lot of these methodologies as black boxes. And I think you can actually get a bit more effort if you actually use some of the underlying principles. We do want to try and finish and be respectful of everybody's time. I think feel free to send me emails on questions, and I will, I'm usually quite good at answering them. And tomorrow morning should be very exciting at TiEcon, and hopefully we'll look at Equia, look at R42, and there'll be other things we're running.
So one last thing I would request, if you have any questions in general, right, which may benefit everyone, maybe the questions will come up after the session. It would be great if you can send me your questions. I'll get the answers from Ranjan and Krishna, and then send it out to everyone, so everybody benefits out of that. So I think, yeah, please, if you have any other questions, yeah.
That's
please.
a very good idea. Yes, exactly. That's because your questions are actually, there's just as much intelligence in the audience as there are in the speakers, and I'll learn too when you ask the questions. I think we all learn as well.
Yeah. And I think towards your just closing comment, the question was on EdTech. It's not really a comment on EdTech, but I learned a lot from Ranjan's presentation. So I think it's a service he's doing to educate people who are new, maybe to AI/ML or even experienced. So I think that's part of the process, is sharing the information, getting everybody up to speed on what's happening in the AI/ML space and learning together. So yeah, with that, thanks everyone for spending your time.